The governor's mansion stood like a crown atop the hill, its white pillars gleaming in the late afternoon sun, while the sprawling gardens below whispered with the soft rustle of magnolia leaves and the occasional flutter of birds startled by a passing carriage. On the surface, it was the epitome of refinement, wealth, and prestige, a place where the city's elite gathered to sip amber brandy, discuss politics, and admire the delicate lacework on fine gowns. Guests would arrive in horse-drawn carriages, announcing their presence with polished brass bells, their eyes scanning the manicured grounds for signs of the grandeur that lay within. Inside, the marble floors reflected the soft glow of chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with portraits of past governors and their wives, their eyes seemingly watching every guest as though they, too, understood the unspoken codes of power and propriety that ruled the household. It was a place where appearances were everything, where social standing could be gained or lost with a single misstep, and where whispers often carried further than shouts. At the heart of this grandeur was the governor's wife, a woman whose beauty and charm were the subject of endless admiration among the city's upper echelons. Her presence at every gala and dinner was magnetic, commanding attention not through loud declarations or ostentatious displays, but through the quiet assurance of someone who knew her power and how to wield it with subtlety. Men watched her with a mixture of awe and desire, while women envied the effortless way she navigated social hierarchies, always appearing flawless, her every gesture measured and graceful. Yet beneath that flawless exterior, there was a shadow, a quiet tension that seemed to hum just beneath her smiles, detectable only to those who dared look closely. It was said that her eyes held secrets that the grand halls could not conceal, that behind the soft laugh and elegant poise, there was a mind constantly calculating, constantly observing, constantly craving more than the polite world around her could offer. Even in the seemingly mundane routines of the mansion, there were hints that not all was as serene as it appeared. The servants, who moved silently through the halls, whispered among themselves about doors that were never to be opened and corridors that led nowhere visible to the eyes of ordinary guests. Strange deliveries appeared at the back entrances, always late at night, always handled with discretion, their contents known only to a select few. There were rumors, deliberately vague, yet insistent, about the governor's wife's private hours, hours that no one dared to question but which everyone speculated about. Some spoke in hushed tones of the slaves who seemed to vanish for days, returning pale and silent, their eyes clouded with fear and fascination. Others hinted at secret meetings behind closed doors, the faint sound of whispered conversations carried by the draft through ornate keyholes, conversations that never reached the ears of the governor himself, at least not that anyone could confirm. The parties, meanwhile, were a study in contrasts. Laughter and music spilled across the polished floors, glasses clinking in celebration of wealth and influence, while the air carried a tension that only the keenest observers could perceive. Beneath the gilded masks and polite conversation, there were glances exchanged that spoke of alliances, betrayals, and desires too dangerous to name aloud. The governor's wife moved through this world like a conductor guiding an orchestra, every smile, every tilt of her head, every seemingly casual word designed to maintain her careful control. Yet even as she charmed the guests, a different persona existed in the corners of the mansion, where shadows clung to walls and the air grew heavy with the unspoken. It was a world of obsession, of secret indulgences, of desires that could not survive daylight scrutiny, and of acts that, if revealed, would shatter the very foundation of the world she had so meticulously constructed. Outside, the city went about its business, unaware of the darkness that lingered atop the hill. Merchants haggled over goods, children played in dusty streets, and town criers shouted the news of the day, but none could glimpse the hidden turmoil within the mansion's walls. The contrast between the public facade and private reality could not have been starker. To outsiders, she was the perfect hostess, the embodiment of grace and refinement, a jewel of the governor's household. But to those who glimpsed the flicker of her true nature, there was a sense of unease, a recognition that beneath the carefully curated beauty lay a mind capable of horrors as elegant as they were terrifying. It was a place where power and desire collided, where charm could conceal obsession, and where the line between love, lust, and violence was thin, fragile, and constantly shifting. The governor's wife, for all her outward allure, was a mistress of shadows, a woman whose secrets would eventually turn the very walls of her magnificent home into a tomb of chilling revelations. Beneath the refined veneer of the governor's mansion, a hidden world pulsed with secret desires and forbidden passions, a world in which the governor's wife held absolute sway. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as whispers of attention paid to certain young slaves, glances that lingered too long, touches that seemed casual but were calculated with precision. She had an uncanny ability to read people, to sense vulnerability and curiosity, and to mold it to her will. What may have seemed like innocent flirtation to an outsider was, in truth, a carefully orchestrated dance of power, control, and seduction. The slaves she favored were drawn into a web of desire that they could neither resist nor fully comprehend, caught between fear and fascination, loyalty and longing. For her, it was not merely physical, it was dominion. Each act of intimacy was a demonstration of authority, a way to assert her unchallenged power over those who were, by law, already subjugated. Yet, in private, she turned this power into obsession, each encounter leaving her hungrier for the next, each surrender of her lovers feeding a growing darkness within. Her relationships with the slaves were shrouded in secrecy, the mansion's opulent halls hiding the whispers, the hurried glances, the stolen moments that existed in shadows. She selected her companions with care, observing them for weeks, noting their temperament, their fears, and their capacity for obedience. Some were clever enough to resist, and she would discard them without remorse, leaving only the ones who could be molded, who could thrill her with their devotion and submission. She thrived on the tension, on the delicate balance between pleasure and danger, knowing that discovery would ruin her carefully constructed life. It was this constant dance along the edge of exposure that exhilarated her, a thrill that combined lust, power, and the intoxicating certainty that she could manipulate the world around her without consequence. In those private chambers, she became both goddess and executioner, commanding loyalty and inflicting fear in equal measure. The psychological weight of these liaisons was immense, not only for the slaves, but for herself. There was a relentless, almost obsessive need to control the narrative, to ensure that every detail of her secret life remained hidden from the prying eyes of the household and society. Yet control was never enough. It had to be absolute. Each interaction was calculated, each encounter designed to deepen the dependency of her lovers, to bind them to her whims, to create a situation where their lives, their very existence, revolved around her approval and desire. She understood human nature in ways that terrified those who glimpsed it. How fear could be a potent aphrodisiac, how devotion could be manipulated, and how the promise of intimacy could become both reward and punishment. It was a psychological game, a macabre form of artistry in which she was both painter and canvas, shaping the desires of others while feeding the growing darkness within her own heart. At the same time, there was a profound loneliness that accompanied her dominance. No one could truly understand her world, not the governor, not the guests who adored her at lavish dinners, not the servants who quietly performed their duties. She existed in a space between admiration and isolation, where power was both intoxicating and isolating, where desire was intertwined with danger, and where every relationship carried the risk of exposure, rebellion, or betrayal. The intensity of her private life contrasted sharply with the serene facade she maintained publicly. To the city, she was perfection itself, poised, charming, elegant, untouchable. But behind closed doors, she was a woman consumed by obsession, craving control, and testing the limits of human desire and endurance. It was in these contradictions that her true power lay, a duality that fascinated some, terrified others, and would ultimately lead to horror beyond imagination. The mansion itself seemed to respond to this tension, its walls absorbing the unspoken secrets, its corridors echoing with hushed voices and footsteps that disappeared into shadowed corners. Servants would sometimes catch glimpses of her with a favored slave, their faces pale, their movements tense, their loyalty unquestioned yet strained. In the dead of night, the The flicker of candlelight revealed hurried meetings in hidden chambers, locked doors, and the soft sounds of whispered words and stifled moans, all underscoring the dangerous intimacy that thrived under the guise of propriety. The governor's wife was always vigilant, ensuring that nothing left these private spaces. No one could speak freely, and no curiosity could pierce her carefully constructed veil of secrecy. It was a world built on manipulation, desire, and the knowledge that those who dared defy her would face consequences far darker than simple social exile. Yet, the line between desire and obsession grew thinner with every passing month. What began as a thrilling indulgence in secret pleasure transformed into a compulsion that consumed her every thought. Each slave who succumbed to her charms became another thread in the intricate web she wove, and with each new thread, the stakes increased. The fear of being caught, the thrill of power, and the satisfaction of control merged into a potent cocktail that clouded judgment and eroded empathy. Those who entered her orbit could not escape, and those who left, either through rebellion or death, left a mark on her psyche, a memory that twisted desire into a dangerous fixation. The mansion, once a symbol of refinement and social prominence, became a stage for this psychological theater, its halls silent witnesses to the unfolding drama, its walls steeped in secrets that would one day burst forth in shocking revelation. There were small hints that all was not well, subtle disruptions that only those paying attention could notice. A favored servant might disappear for days, returning pale, withdrawn, and unusually compliant, while whispers of strange happenings circulated among the household staff. Guests might sense an undercurrent of tension during a dinner party, a fleeting shadow behind the governor's wife's smile, a glance that seemed to conceal more than it revealed. But such observations were easily dismissed in a world where appearances were paramount, and the brilliance of her social presence often overshadowed any suspicion. Still, for those who dared to look closer, the truth was undeniable. Behind the charm and elegance lay a mind consumed by secrecy, a woman whose forbidden passions were building towards something far more sinister than anyone could imagine. In this environment of hidden desires, manipulation, and psychological tension, the stage was set for the tragedies to come. The governor's wife, for all her beauty and social mastery, was a woman whose obsessions could not be contained, whose need for control would escalate, and whose dark inclinations would soon collide with fate in ways that would shock an entire community. Every smile, every whispered word, every clandestine meeting contributed to a narrative that was as dangerous as it was enthralling, drawing the audience of her own life deeper into a web of power, desire, and ultimately, horror. In these shadowed halls, the seeds of terror were quietly sown, and no one, neither slave nor noble guest, could foresee the depth of darkness that lay ahead. The first death came quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the mansion itself had conspired to conceal it. No one outside the intimate circle of the governor's wife could have anticipated the horror that would unfold, and even those within her inner orbit were too blinded by fear, desire, or loyalty to fully grasp the implications. It began with the disappearance of a young slave, a man known for his intelligence and quiet confidence, someone whose presence had long been a source of fascination for the governor's wife. To outsiders, it was easy to assume he had been assigned to distant work or sent on errands that took him away from the mansion. But those who had observed the subtle power she wielded over her lovers knew better. In her eyes, he had become a threat, not because of defiance or betrayal, but because he had begun to exhibit a will of his own, a spark of independence that refused to bend entirely to her command. The night of the murder was unremarkable in its outward appearance. The mansion was alive with the usual sounds of candlelight flickering against the walls, soft music from a distant piano, and the low murmur of servants carrying out their duties. Guests had long since retired to their chambers, and the governor himself was absorbed in his correspondence, unaware of the storm brewing behind locked doors. In a hidden wing of the mansion, the governor's wife had orchestrated a meeting with the young man, ostensibly for private conversation, but in reality, it was a calculated setup. She had chosen her instruments of control with precision: candles to illuminate the room in a ghostly glow, the soft creak of floorboards to mask her movements, and the carefully timed approach of the mansion's most loyal servants who would ensure no interruption. Everything was meticulously planned, every detail designed to maintain her veneer of innocence should anyone question the young man's sudden disappearance. The act itself was swift, cruel, and chillingly deliberate. She wielded authority with the cold efficiency of someone who had long practiced domination, and the young man, though strong and intelligent, was unprepared for the depths of her resolve. Fear and surprise overtook him, stripping away the bravado he may have carried into the encounter. What followed was a brief, horrific struggle, a dance of desperation and control that ended with his life extinguished in the shadowed room. It was over before anyone could intervene, leaving behind only the faint scent of wax, the echo of a single, muffled cry, and a heavy silence that seemed to hang over the mansion as though it had absorbed the violence itself. In that silence, the governor's wife felt both exhilaration and satisfaction, a twisted triumph born from the mastery of her secret world. Once the act was complete, the challenge became concealment. She understood instinctively that discovery would destroy everything she had built, her social reputation, her influence, and even her freedom. She chose a method both ingenious and macabre. The young man's body was hidden within a bricked-up section of the wine cellar, a space long used for storage but altered under her direction to become a hidden tomb. Brick by brick, the cellar walls grew heavier, concealing her first crime with a meticulousness that reflected both obsession and intelligence. Each placement of mortar was deliberate, a ritual in itself, a way of asserting control over death as she had asserted control over life. The cellar, once a symbol of abundance and celebration, became a silent witness to her darkest inclinations, a chilling repository of human life extinguished in secrecy. The immediate aftermath was subtle but telling. Servants noted the young man's absence. Whispered questions were raised, and small rumors began to circulate. Yet the governor's wife's skill at manipulation was unparalleled. She deflected attention with charm, feigned concern, and carefully timed displays of grief that disarmed suspicion. Even those closest to her found it impossible to reconcile the outward display of mourning with the unsettling aura that seemed to cling to her presence. Her psychological mastery was as terrifying as her act of violence. She had not only taken a life, but had manipulated the perceptions of everyone around her, ensuring that the mansion's social machinery continued to function smoothly while the truth remained buried behind layers of deception. In the following weeks, the tension within the household was palpable. Other slaves grew wary, sensing the invisible hand of danger that now moved through the halls, while the governor remained blissfully unaware, absorbed in his duties and public appearances. The governor's wife, meanwhile, became increasingly fixated on control, observing those around her with heightened scrutiny, searching for any signs of disobedience or curiosity that could threaten her carefully constructed secret. Every glance, every movement, and every word became a test of loyalty, a subtle evaluation of whether someone might one day uncover the hidden horrors within the mansion's walls. The psychological strain was immense, but for her, it became intoxicating, a heady mixture of fear, power, and pleasure that fed a cycle of obsession and domination. The first murder also marked a turning point in her relationships with the remaining slaves. Where once there may have been a playful tension, there now existed a pervasive sense of dread, an awareness that stepping outside her favor could result in consequences far more severe than simple punishment. Yet this fear did not diminish desire. It intensified it, creating a dynamic in which power, lust, and terror were inseparable. Each new interaction was layered with risk, each moment charged with unspoken tension, and each demonstration of obedience reinforced the psychological grip she held over her companions. The mansion, already a theater of social performance, now became a stage for psychological horror, with its inhabitants playing roles they had no choice but to perform, each under the watchful, calculating gaze of a woman whose obsession was growing beyond control. Rumors began to circulate outside the mansion, though never with concrete proof. Townspeople spoke in hushed tones of the young man who had vanished without explanation, speculating on distant travel, sudden illness, or even escape. None suspected the true horror, for the governor's wife's social mastery and public charm were sufficient to mask the darkness beneath. Even the most inquisitive observers were deceived, their suspicions allayed by her careful orchestration of public appearances and the seeming normalcy of daily life. It was a dangerous game of perception, one in which she excelled, ensuring that the first crime remained unconnected to her, while simultaneously tightening the psychological hold she had on those within her private world. The first death, while hidden, was not without consequence for her own psyche. The act of taking life and concealing it in such an intimate and deliberate manner changed something within her, sharpening her obsessions, hardening her control, and igniting a fascination with the boundary between life and death. It became clear to her, perhaps for the first time in such concrete terms, that she had the power to shape reality according to her desires, to manipulate fate itself, and to bend those around her to her will. Each brick placed over the hidden body was a reminder of her ability to dominate, and yet also a seed of escalating madness, a prelude to the horrors that would soon follow, as one death became insufficient, and the shadowed corridors of the mansion whispered of further atrocities yet to come. Thus, the stage was set for a sequence of escalating terror, as the governor's wife stepped fully into the role of both manipulator and executioner. The mansion, with its elegance and grandeur, masked the darkness that was growing ever more potent behind its walls. The first murder was a harbinger, a signal that her obsession and capacity for violence had begun to consume not just the lives of others, but the moral boundaries that separated fascination from horror. Every smile she offered to her guests, every carefully measured word in public, belied the storm that raged in her private chambers, a storm that would soon shatter illusions, unravel lives, and leave an indelible mark on the history of the city, the mansion, and all who dared cross her path. The cellar, once a place of mundane utility, where barrels of wine were stored and the cool air provided relief from the summer heat, became something far darker in the hands of the governor's wife. It was here, beneath the polished floors and opulent halls, that the first death had been concealed, but over time, the space transformed into a chamber of horror, a silent crypt that bore witness to acts that would shock any who glimpsed them. The bricked-up alcoves were her private masterpieces, each one meticulously constructed, each brick carefully laid to conceal not just bodies, but secrets that could unravel her life entirely if discovered. To her, the cellar was more than a hiding place. It was a domain over which she exercised absolute control, a tangible manifestation of her power over life, death, and the perceptions of those around her. Every visit to the cellar was an affirmation of her dominion, a ritual that strengthened her psychological hold over the household, the mansion, and herself. As her obsessions grew, so did the number of victims. Slaves who had once been charmed, drawn into her web of forbidden passion, now became pawns in a grotesque game of domination and concealment. Those who resisted her authority, who dared question her desires, or who simply fell out of favor, were led to the cellar, where she ensured their fate with chilling precision. Each death was an extension of her need for control, each concealment a testament to her ingenuity and meticulousness. There was an artistry to it, as horrifying as it was calculated. Brick by brick, the walls closed over the bodies, sealing their existence from the world above, while amplifying the psychological tension that thrummed through the mansion's every corridor. The very air seemed charged with the weight of the secrets buried beneath polished floors and ornate furniture, a silent reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of elegance. The servants, though largely powerless, began to sense the change in the mansion's atmosphere. Whispers spread through the hallways like a cold wind, subtle and fearful, touching the ears of those who might never speak of it aloud. A missing slave here, a sudden disappearance there, small discrepancies in the daily routines. All were noted with a mixture of fear and awe. Those who dared speculate or question were quickly silenced, either through intimidation or careful manipulation, until an uneasy silence settled over the household. The mansion operated like a machine, each person a cog conditioned to ignore the evidence of horror that accumulated beneath their feet. And yet, the human instinct to sense danger persisted, even when one's mind tried to rationalize it away. The cellar, with its bricked-up alcoves and hidden corners, became the silent nucleus of terror, a place where fear, desire, and death intertwined in ways that could not be undone. Visitors and townspeople remained blissfully unaware, lulled by the governor's wife's charm and the mansion's social grandeur. To the public, she continued to embody grace, elegance, and refinement. Yet inside, her obsession with secrecy had intensified to a level that bordered on mania. She moved among her guests with the same composure and poise as always, but the contrast between her public persona and private indulgences grew ever more stark. Every party she hosted, every smile she offered, every carefully orchestrated gesture was performed with the knowledge that beneath the floors and walls of the mansion, the bodies of her lovers lay concealed, their existence a grim testament to the extremes of her obsession. It was a duality that few could comprehend. The perfection of social presentation masking a web of horror, manipulation, and death. The Brickton Cellar became a study in psychological terror, not just for the victims, but for the woman herself. She derived a perverse satisfaction from the knowledge that these bodies, once vibrant with life, were now entombed, existing only as silent witnesses to her power. Yet alongside this satisfaction grew an increasing compulsion, a craving for more control, more mastery, more victims. The cellar, initially a practical solution for concealment, became a symbolic altar upon which her desires, obsessions, and darkest impulses were enacted. She developed routines around it, checking the walls, ensuring the integrity of her work, and at times lingering with a fascination that bordered on reverence. The act of concealment was ritualistic, as much about the psychological affirmation of her control as about hiding evidence. Each brick, each layer of mortar, each sealed alcove became a measure of her authority over life and death, a tangible manifestation of the monstrous duality within her. With each new death, the mansion's atmosphere thickened, the tension palpable to anyone attuned to it. Even those who remained ignorant of the specifics could sense a pervasive unease, an intangible weight that clung to the walls, seeped into the floors, and hovered in the air like a warning. Some slaves grew hypervigilant, their steps measured and careful, their glances frequently darting toward hidden doors or the cellar stairs, wondering silently who might vanish next. Others became withdrawn, their expressions masked with forced obedience, silently calculating how to survive the oppressive force of the governor's wife's will. The household, once a scene of bustling activity and polite charm, now resembled a fragile ecosystem balanced on fear, desire, and the unpredictable whims of a woman whose genius for manipulation had escalated to dangerous heights. The horror of the cellar extended beyond the physical act of bricking in bodies. It was psychological, both for the woman and the few who glimpsed the signs of her growing madness. The act of concealment allowed her to internalize a sense of omnipotence, as though she alone controlled life, death, and reality within the mansion's walls. And yet, this sense of control was paradoxical. The deeper she sank into obsession, the more fragile her equilibrium became. Each new body added weight to the secret she carried, not only in literal terms beneath the floorboards, but as a psychological burden that could collapse under scrutiny. Her mind, already sharpened by power and manipulation, became increasingly consumed by patterns of obsession, paranoia, and compulsive calculation. The cellar was no longer merely a hiding place. It was a mirror reflecting the extremes of her nature, a silent judge that confirmed both her mastery and her madness. It was during this period that small anomalies began to surface in ways that could not be ignored forever. Servants occasionally noted muffled sounds in the deep recesses of the cellar, the faint echo of movement that should not have existed in an abandoned space. Strange odors, subtle and fleeting, hinted at decay and secrets long buried. The governor himself, though preoccupied with affairs of state, occasionally remarked on the oppressive atmosphere, the subtle weight in the mansion's air that seemed to press upon every room. Yet each time concern threatened to surface, the governor's wife deflected it with practiced charm, feigned concern, or gentle reminders that life in a large household carried occasional inconveniences. To all appearances, the mansion remained a bastion of wealth, civility, and refinement, but beneath its floors, horror had taken root, quietly waiting to emerge. By now, the cellar had become a labyrinth of secrets, a hidden world in which her obsession could play out unchecked. The bricked-in alcoves multiplied, each one a carefully concealed repository of past passion, disobedience, or perceived betrayal. Her psychological dominion extended over those above ground and those beneath, creating a chilling contrast between the elegance of her public life and the monstrosity she enacted in private. The act of concealment became almost ceremonial, a dark ritual in which she reaffirmed her power over life and death, over loyalty and fear, over desire and terror. Each brick laid was both a literal and symbolic affirmation of her control, an assertion that in this mansion, she dictated not only who lived and who died, but how the world perceived her. Yet despite the meticulous concealment, the seeds of eventual discovery were planted in these actions. The deeper the horror grew, the more precarious her situation became. The physical and psychological weight of the cellar, its walls filled with bricked-in bodies, became a silent pressure that threatened to crack under the strain of curiosity, accident, or betrayal. Even the most careful planning could not account for the unpredictable. An observant servant, a nosy guest, or a sudden misstep could unravel everything. The horror of the cellar was thus twofold: the obvious terror of death and entombment, and the looming, invisible threat that her world of secrets might collapse at any moment. It was a delicate balance between mastery and madness, between control and catastrophe, and the governor's wife navigated it with a combination of genius, obsession, and creeping instability. In the end, the cellar stood as both sanctuary and nightmare, a hidden monument to obsession, desire, and terror. Within its bricked walls lay not only the victims of her dark inclinations, but also the reflection of a mind consumed by secrecy and domination. The elegance of the mansion above could not mask the psychological and moral rot festering below. It only highlighted the contrast between appearances and reality, charm and monstrosity, power and madness. In that silent, suffocating space, the foundations of her crimes were laid, both literally and figuratively, setting the stage for the unraveling that would shock the household, the city, and history itself. The bricked-up cellar was no longer just a hiding place. It had become a symbol, a warning, and a prelude to horrors yet unimaginable, a chilling testament to the extremes of human obsession and the terrifying potential of power unchecked by conscience. The mansion's carefully constructed world of secrecy could not remain hidden forever. The first tremors of discovery began subtly, in ways that the governor's wife could not fully anticipate or control. A servant, new to the household and unacquainted with its unspoken rules, noticed inconsistencies: a faint draft in the wine cellar where none should exist, the scent of damp earth and decay, and the suspicious absence of one of the slaves who had been a favorite of the governor's wife. Though fear restrained the servant from speaking immediately, the mind is rarely contained when confronted with an unsettling truth. Suspicion began to grow, whispered cautiously to another trusted servant, creating a ripple of unease throughout the household. What had once been controlled chaos was now edging toward exposure, and the tension in the mansion thickened like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of revelation. The first investigative steps were modest but urgent. Town officials, prompted by vague reports of missing slaves and unusual activity at the mansion, began inquiries that were polite but probing. They asked neighbors about the whereabouts of the absent individuals, noted patterns of the household routines, and occasionally sent agents to observe the mansion discreetly. To the public, these were minor, bureaucratic matters, but to those within the household, they were harbingers of potential disaster. The governor's wife, ever perceptive, detected the shift immediately, recognizing the threat that even casual observation posed to her carefully maintained world. Her outward demeanor remained flawless: smiles, polite conversation, and graceful gestures. But behind those eyes lay a calculating mind, devising contingencies and strategies to maintain control over an increasingly precarious situation. As the investigation deepened, rumors spread like wildfire through the town. Neighbors whispered about shadows glimpsed behind cellar doors, about fleeting cries heard on nights of heavy storm, and about the sudden, unexplained absence of slaves who had previously been seen in the mansion's company. The townspeople, accustomed to the governor's wife's charm and social prominence, were initially hesitant to confront the possibility of wrongdoing. Yet human curiosity is relentless, and fear mixed with fascination created a potent narrative that quickly took hold. Local newspapers, once deferential in reporting on elite households, began hinting at scandal, carefully choosing language that suggested concern without outright accusation. The mansion's reputation, previously untouchable, became a subject of hushed speculation, and the cracks in its gilded facade began to widen. The first breakthrough came when one of the loyal servants, coerced by fear and loyalty in equal measure, disclosed what they had observed in the cellar. Investigators approached cautiously, knowing that any misstep could compromise their own safety and the integrity of the investigation. When the bricked-up sections of the wine cellar were discovered, the horror that awaited them was immediate and overwhelming. The walls, once symbols of storage and wealth, revealed the silent evidence of death, bodies carefully concealed, the result of meticulous planning and morbid ingenuity. Shock rippled through the officials and the household alike, as the scale of the governor's wife's actions became undeniably clear. The elegance of the mansion could no longer mask the darkness lurking beneath, and the community was forced to confront a reality far more grotesque than any rumor could have suggested. The trial that followed became an event of immense social and historical significance. The governor's wife, once admired for her poise and social grace, now faced scrutiny and condemnation, her charm powerless against the weight of irrefutable evidence. Courtroom observers described her as calm, yet inscrutable, her composure unnerving in the face of the horrors revealed. Witnesses recounted the disappearances, the whispered warnings among the servants, and the chilling details of the cellar, each statement layering the narrative with tension and horror. The public, riveted by the story, hung on every word, alternating between fascination and disbelief as the trial unfolded. The courtroom became a theater of human emotion, where grief, anger, fear, and disbelief collided, and the contrast between her previous public image and the monstrous reality was laid bare for all to see. During the proceedings, the psychological dimensions of her actions were scrutinized as much as the physical evidence. Experts and witnesses attempted to understand the mind that could orchestrate such horrors, to reconcile the duality of social grace and private monstrosity. Observers noted her ability to manipulate perceptions even under scrutiny, the subtle ways she maintained a semblance of control over the narrative despite overwhelming evidence. Yet the scale of her crimes, and the audacity of hiding multiple victims in the mansion's cellar, could not be denied or softened by charm. Her psychological manipulation, once so effective in private, became a tool for public fascination, revealing the extremes of human obsession and the terrifying capacity for cruelty when power and desire intertwine unchecked. The courtroom also became a stage for the reactions of those who had lived in fear within the mansion. Servants and former slaves, once silenced by intimidation, now spoke freely, recounting moments of terror, manipulation, and despair. Their testimonies painted a portrait of a household gripped by psychological terror, where obedience and fear coexisted with fascination and desire, and where the governor's wife's control was absolute until the evidence forced it to unravel. Emotional testimony from those who had survived, and accounts of whispered rumors and vanished companions, provided a chilling texture to the narrative, demonstrating that the horror was not limited to the victims entombed beneath the cellar, but extended to the very atmosphere of the household itself. Public reaction outside the courtroom was intense. Townspeople, who had once admired her, were caught between disbelief and revulsion. The contrast between the elegance of her public persona and the grotesque nature of her crimes fueled a collective fascination with both the horror and the psychological depth of her actions. Artists, writers, and chroniclers of the time seized upon the story, ensuring that it would linger in the social consciousness long after the trial concluded. The governor's wife became a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a subject of fascination, embodying both the extremes of human desire and the terrifying potential of social power when divorced from conscience. The verdict, when it finally came, was the culmination of this tension. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge pronounced judgment, a sentence reflecting both the scale of her crimes and the moral outrage of the community. While justice in its legal form was served, the psychological and social impact of her actions would resonate far longer, leaving an indelible mark on the city, the mansion, and the historical record. Her legacy, now intertwined with horror and fascination, served as a stark reminder that charm and refinement can mask monstrosity, that social power can be wielded as both a shield and a weapon, and that even the most meticulously constructed facades can crumble under the weight of human obsession. By the trial's conclusion, the mansion itself had been transformed from a symbol of elegance into a site of public horror. Investigators, historians, and curious townspeople alike would remember the bricked-up cellar as a chilling monument to obsession, secrecy, and cruelty. The psychological tension that had once pervaded the household now extended outward, creating a narrative that transcended time, influencing generations who would study, recount, and dramatize the events for both fascination and caution. The governor's wife, stripped of her public charm, became emblematic of the extremes of human behavior, a figure whose calculated control and obsessive desires had produced consequences that could neither be hidden nor ignored. Her crimes, methodical and deliberate, were etched into history, leaving a story of terror, intrigue, and dark fascination that would continue to captivate and horrify all who heard it. The mansion, once a symbol of elegance and social dominance, now stood shrouded in infamy. The bricks that concealed the lives she had taken had become more than a physical barrier. They were a monument to obsession, a chilling testament to the extremes of human desire and cruelty. Even after the trial concluded, the psychological weight of her crimes lingered, casting a shadow over every corner of the city and every memory of the once admired governor's wife. People spoke her name with a mixture of fear, fascination, and disbelief, unable to reconcile the woman who had hosted dazzling parties and charmed the elite with the monster who had meticulously concealed death beneath the floors of her home. In quiet whispers and hushed tones, the town recounted the horror, each retelling deepening the aura of dread that clung to her legacy. For the survivors, the servants who had witnessed the subtle manipulations, the fear-laden glances, and the vanished companions, the aftermath was a complex mixture of relief, grief, and lingering terror. Their lives, once governed by obedience and the unspoken rules of survival within the mansion, were forever altered. The psychological scars left by living under such intense control could not easily be healed. Fear had been their constant companion, and the knowledge of the cellar's contents transformed every memory of the mansion into a haunting reminder of mortality, vulnerability, and the delicate balance between compliance and rebellion. Even as time passed and life outside the mansion resumed a semblance of normalcy, the echoes of the horrors endured within those walls remained, leaving an indelible imprint on their minds and stories that would be passed down for generations. The governor's wife, removed from the public eye and stripped of her power, became a figure studied for her psychological complexity as much as condemned for her cruelty. Scholars, psychologists, and curious observers sought to understand what could drive a woman of social refinement and intelligence to commit such calculated acts of violence. The duality of her existence, a life of elegance and charm juxtaposed with obsession, cruelty, and meticulous murder, became a central focus of discussion and analysis. How could one balance public admiration with private monstrosity? How could charm and calculated manipulation coexist with homicidal tendencies? These questions haunted not only those who knew her personally, but also the broader public fascinated by the dark recesses of human nature. In this, she became more than a criminal. She became a case study in obsession, control, and the terrifying potential for darkness in even the most polished human exterior. The mansion itself became a symbol of the dichotomy between beauty and horror, a site where history and legend intertwined. Visitors to the city, whether drawn by curiosity or morbid fascination, often sought glimpses of the now empty halls, imagining the shadows that had once haunted the corridors and the cellar that had hidden unspeakable acts. The grandeur of the architecture, the polished floors, and the opulent furnishings stood in stark contrast to the grim reality that had occurred beneath them. In this way, the physical space became a reflection of her psyche, outwardly perfect, meticulously maintained, yet harboring darkness in every hidden corner. The mansion's transformation from social hub to historical symbol of terror ensured that her story would not be forgotten, that the lessons and fascination derived from it would endure long after the bricks had settled in silence. Her crimes also forced a broader societal reflection on the structures that had enabled them. The dynamics of power, gender, and social hierarchy that allowed a woman of influence to manipulate and conceal her actions became central to discussions both then and in the historical record. Slavery, social privilege, and the blind admiration of elite figures created an environment in which her actions could be executed with minimal immediate consequence. By examining these factors, historians and social commentators highlighted how systemic inequalities and societal blind spots can allow extraordinary abuses of power to occur. In this way, her story served as both a chilling cautionary tale and a lens through which to examine the broader moral and ethical failures of her era, emphasizing that horror is not solely born of individual obsession, but also nurtured by the complicity and inattentiveness of society. Psychologically, the governor's wife's legacy persisted in ways that fascinated and disturbed observers alike. The meticulousness with which she concealed the Cellar victims, the strategic manipulation of those around her, and the combination of charm, cunning, and obsession presented a case study in extreme human behavior. Analysts speculated about the origin of her compulsions, whether they were born of an unquenchable desire for control, latent cruelty, or a combination of psychological predispositions exacerbated by opportunity and societal privilege. The careful orchestration of murders and concealments suggested a mind both methodical and morbidly creative, capable of maintaining composure while executing unspeakable acts. This duality became central to her historical image, the intersection of intellect, beauty, and monstrous behavior forming a narrative that was as compelling as it was horrifying. The impact on the town and the broader historical memory was immediate and enduring. Stories of the bricked-up cellar and the missing slaves became the subject of folklore, warnings, and cautionary tales. Writers and chroniclers documented the events with a mix of fascination and moral outrage, ensuring that the horror transcended the immediate legal and social consequences. People spoke of the mansion with reverence and fear, a site where human ambition, desire, and obsession had collided in ways that permanently altered both the physical space and the collective consciousness. Over time, her story became emblematic of the extremes of human obsession and the terrifying capacity of one individual to impose their will upon life and death with meticulous precision. Even as the years passed, her tale remained a touchstone for understanding the darker impulses of human nature. Scholars, historians, and true crime enthusiasts alike analyzed her actions, examining the psychological, social, and historical factors that allowed such atrocities to occur. Discussions often revolved around the contrast between public perception and private reality, the ability of charm and social mastery to mask monstrosity, and the consequences of unchecked obsession. In this, her legacy was not limited to horror. It became a lens through which human behavior, morality, and societal structures could be interrogated. The mansion, the cellar, and the stories surrounding her life and crimes persisted as symbols, challenging observers to confront the uncomfortable truths about power, desire, and the human capacity for darkness. Ultimately, the legacy of the governor's wife was both a historical caution and a psychological study. Her brilliance, charm, and influence had allowed her to execute horrors that defied imagination, but it was the consequences, the ruin of lives, the indelible fear imprinted on survivors, and the social reckoning that cemented her place in history. The mansion remained as a silent witness, a testament to the horrors that can flourish in secrecy, and a stark reminder of the duality inherent in human nature: beauty and horror, charm and cruelty, power and vulnerability. The interplay of these forces defined her story and ensured that the lessons drawn from it would resonate long after the trial ended, long after the bricks had settled, and long after the world had been forced to reckon with the terrifying reality of her obsession. In the end, the story of the governor's wife is not simply one of murder and concealment. It is a story of human fascination with extremes, the ways in which power, desire, and psychological compulsion can collide to create acts that shock, horrify, and captivate. It is a tale of social structures that permit, if not encourage, such darkness to thrive, and of the human mind's capacity to both construct and conceal horror. The bricked-up cellar, the vanished lives, and the meticulously maintained facade all serve as enduring reminders of the fragility of morality in the face of obsession and the enduring fascination that arises when elegance masks monstrosity. Her legacy, chilling and unforgettable, is a story that continues to echo through history, a dark mirror held up to the extremes of human behavior, power, and desire. Even decades later, the story of the governor's wife haunted the city, the mansion, and the imagination of anyone who dared to learn of it. Though the physical evidence of her crimes, the bricked-up cellar, the missing slaves, had been exposed, the psychological imprint remained far more pervasive. Scholars, chroniclers, and curious visitors all returned to the narrative, drawn not merely by the act of murder itself, but by the intricate web of manipulation, obsession, and secrecy that allowed such horror to flourish undetected for so long. The fascination with her story was as much about human nature as it was about her crimes. The capacity for charm to mask monstrosity, for power to corrupt, and for desire to evolve into obsession and cruelty. In this, her life became a lens through which generations could explore the extremes of morality, psychology, and societal failure. Historians reflected on the delicate balance between public image and private reality, noting how her meticulous control of appearances allowed her to evade suspicion for so long. The governor's wife had mastered the art of duality, the outwardly refined, gracious hostess and the secretive, calculating murderer who could decide the fate of life and death in her hidden world. Her actions challenged assumptions about the boundaries of human behavior, revealing the unsettling truth that intelligence, charm, and social status can coexist with profound cruelty and psychological instability. This duality has fascinated true crime enthusiasts for generations, forming a narrative in which beauty and horror, civility and monstrosity, existed in uneasy but undeniable tension. The mansion itself, preserved in memory if not in form, became an enduring symbol of these tensions. Each corridor, each polished floor, each window overlooking the manicured gardens carried with it the weight of history and horror. The cellar, long since sealed and abandoned, was remembered as the epicenter of terror, a place where life and death had collided under the hands of a woman whose genius and madness intertwined so closely as to be indistinguishable. Visitors and students of history imagined the hidden chambers, the bricked-in alcoves, and the silent victims whose existence had been erased from the visible world, but whose presence continued to resonate in every recounting of the tale. In this way, the physical space became inseparable from the psychological and historical narrative, a haunting reminder of the fragility of appearances and the extremes of human obsession. Psychologists and criminologists analyzing her case noted the sophistication of her methods and the clarity of her intention. She was not driven by impulsive rage or blind passion, but by a carefully constructed need for control that extended to life and death itself. Each murder was planned, each concealment executed with meticulous precision, and each interaction with her household carefully managed to maintain secrecy and authority. Her behavior exemplified a chilling combination of intelligence, obsession, and moral detachment, a profile that has become a reference point in understanding extreme cases of manipulation and murder. The story illustrates the terrifying capacity of a human mind to rationalize cruelty, transform desire into control, and construct elaborate systems to maintain dominion over others, even as societal norms might have predicted compassion or restraint. Beyond the psychological and historical significance, the story resonated deeply in the public imagination because of its emotional intensity. The victims, those whose lives were stolen and whose voices had been silenced, represented the human cost of obsession, desire, and unchecked power. Survivors carried with them trauma that could never fully be resolved, living with the weight of fear, the memory of vanished companions, and the constant reminder of the precariousness of life under tyranny. Their stories, interwoven with the narrative of the governor's wife, created a tapestry of horror and resilience, illustrating the profound psychological impact of living in proximity to calculated cruelty. Even as historians dissected her actions, they could not erase the human suffering that formed the emotional core of the tale. In examining her legacy, one cannot ignore the societal structures that enabled such behavior. Slavery, rigid social hierarchies, and the blind admiration of elite figures created an environment in which her obsessions could thrive without interference for years. The story highlights how power, when unchallenged, can amplify the darker aspects of human nature, allowing actions that might otherwise be constrained by conscience or societal checks to escalate unchecked. This context is critical not merely for historical understanding, but for the enduring lessons it offers about the dynamics of authority, privilege, and moral responsibility. Her crimes were personal, calculated, and horrifying, but they were also a reflection of the vulnerabilities and complicity inherent in the society around her. The echoes of her actions extended into literature, art, and folklore. Chroniclers painted her as both villain and enigma, a woman whose beauty, intelligence, and social presence masked unfathomable cruelty. Writers explored her psychology, dramatizing the interplay of desire, power, and obsession, while artists rendered the mansion and the cellar in shadowed, evocative images that captured the horror and fascination simultaneously. Over time, her story became more than a historical account. It evolved into myth, legend, and cautionary tale. It served as a template for narratives exploring the duality of human nature, the capacity for refinement and monstrosity, for charm and cruelty, for social grace and murderous intent. Ultimately, the story of the governor's wife reminds us that horror does not always announce itself with violence or spectacle. Sometimes it thrives in silence, manipulation, and the careful control of perception. Her life illustrates the terrifying potential of obsession when coupled with intelligence and social power, and it continues to captivate because it confronts fundamental questions about human nature. What are the boundaries of morality when one can manipulate life and death? How can appearances deceive, and what horrors may hide behind social charm and refinement? These questions, and the stark answers provided by her deeds, ensure that her story remains as compelling today as it was horrifying in her own time. As history continues to examine and recount her life, the narrative resonates not simply as a tale of murder, but as a broader reflection on the complexities of power, desire, and psychological compulsion. The mansion, the bricked-up cellar, the victims, and the surviving witnesses all combine to form a story that is simultaneously historical, psychological, and moral. The echoes of her obsession, the fascination with her duality, and the horror of her calculated crimes continue to challenge observers to understand the extremes of human behavior, the consequences of unchecked authority, and the enduring tension between outward appearances and hidden realities. In this way, her story transcends the events themselves, becoming a cautionary tale, a psychological case study, and a dark chapter of human history that refuses to fade from memory. Even now, as generations pass, the tale endures. The mansion may crumble, the witnesses may die, and society may evolve, but the story of the governor's wife and her bricked-up cellar remains. It is a haunting reminder that human desire, obsession, and cruelty can intertwine in ways that defy understanding, that elegance and horror can coexist within a single individual, and that history is often shaped not just by events, but by the hidden actions and secret obsessions of those with power. Her story lingers in shadowed corners of imagination, in scholarly works, in folklore, and in the quiet fascination of anyone who contemplates the darkest reaches of human nature, a story that will continue to captivate, horrify, and teach for generations to come.